Welcome to Monologues by Hassie, where I'm going to be dropping unsolicited brain dumps from the depths of my grey matter. I'll talk about life, money, society, and self-development, plus whatever else lies up there, whilst hopefully not getting cancelled in the process. Today, I thought I'd take you on why I've decided to travel slow for my, what you might call a sabbatical from the traditional corporate software engineering world, and take you through a few questions on what I'm doing and why I'm doing them. So, question one that I get is you quit your job to push your skill set to a new level to build and launch digital products. Why did you not choose to do this at home? And for context, home for me is Sydney, Australia. And there's multiple reasons for this. I think the first is because I can. And I think that is a huge reason. I had the opportunity to travel the world. I, for a long time, have wanted to do an around-the-world trip. And for many years, I was accumulating Qantas points through many schemes and things like that. I've got an episode on that, just so I could have the ability to take an around-the-world trip. And I always joked that I'd need to be unemployed to do this. And so I made that happen. So that was a really big reason. The second one was when I realized that I wanted to go and build digital products. I mean, one of my favorite Gen Z terms is it's a skill issue. And I 100% agree with that. Majority of the things that we deal with, not everything of course, really does come down to whether we have invested the time and energy into developing those skills. And as a software dev, in the environment I was in, I loved it. It was a really great, fast-paced environment. I was surrounded by really experienced people. But I definitely felt like a bit of an imposter because I was learning on the job, and there were so many parts of the software engineering lifecycle and beyond that, the product lifecycle, where I did not have the ability to execute. And I still don't, but I'm learning that process. So I wanted to be very selective about how I chose my environment to do two things specifically. I wanted to remove things in my environment back in Sydney, back at home, that were negative and that would distract me from being able to do this. And I wanted to selectively choose positive things. So for the last month, I've been in a place called Penang, Malaysia, and a town called Georgetown, and it's a very nice place to live. But the reason I specifically chose it is I knew it had a good economy and I knew it had a tech sector. And even in the last month, I've been, in the place I live, I'm talking to CEOs who run their own companies, people who are UX, UI designers, other software engineers. And the fact that I'm in close proximity to these people is a very positive thing. So I wanted to make sure I was surrounded by the right influences to go on the journey that I'm going on. I mean, an important reason as well is I've talked about in the past activation energy. And activation energy is what we need to overcome. It's overcoming that discomfort to get to the state we want to. But when we have this concept of activation energy, there is also a concept known as catalysts. And catalysts are things which reduce the activation energy required. And I've already made this decision to take the time to go launch digital products. But I realized that by, again, taking myself out of my previous environment and being very selective, it acts as a catalyst. It reduces the activation energy I need to get over those initial humps. And that just makes the process easier in the long run. So there's many different factors. And I think the one that people are very surprised about is having a low burn rate. So a burn rate is just the amount of money you need, how long you can go off your savings, how long you can go off a very small amount of money. And I wanted the lowest possible burn rate. And for the start of my trip, I decided to live in Asia. And that makes a lot of sense geographically, because from Australia, it's generally the closest continent to get to. It's the easiest for us to go to Asia. And then within Asia, if you pick the right places, the cost of living is quite low. So I wanted a very low burn rate for the first part of my journey because I realized this is where I'm going to be most inefficient. This is where I'm going to be learning new skills. I'm going to be slow. I'm going to be making more mistakes, more costlier mistakes, simply because I'm inexperienced with the things I need to do. Everything from learning the technologies to, for example, launch a mobile app, Right now, this week, I'm struggling with launching a landing page because I realize, and I have great appreciation for people who are great front-end engineers and designers, because that is a skill I don't currently have yet. So I'm looking at ways to solve that. But I realized that the best thing I've done for myself is to put myself in a part of the world where my burn rate is so low that I can afford myself to make these mistakes, and I can afford to make many of them. Because when I do continue on this journey and go to higher cost parts of the world, and beyond this, when I do come home and tackle the next venture, then I have paid off those deficits. I've used the low cost of living areas of the world to really invest in myself. And other reasons are, of course, to meet new people, which I have been doing, explore new ideas. I think I've been able to have conversations and sometimes they spark things in you, and naturally to travel and experience parts of the world. But that is a very small part of what I'm doing. Really, I am probably working more than I've ever worked before. Maybe on a typical week, we're talking 6 days a week to 6.5 days a week. There's always some form of work on the weekend, and it's really about applying that constant pressure. But I do take days off naturally. If I get sick, I will take a day off, which I have done once. And when there is some sort of big festival or I want to go for a hike, that day will be well and truly reserved for relaxation. So that's the reason why I didn't stay in Sydney and decided to travel and work around the world. So I have fallen into that category of digital nomading, and it's been a very interesting experience, and it's taken me a while to get into my flow, but I'm definitely enjoying it, and I'm enjoying all the challenges I'm facing. Like, I was pulling my hair out yesterday, but I think that is a very good thing to be doing in the grand scheme of things. So the next question is, why travel slow? If you gave yourself 9 months to travel, why have you chosen to stay somewhere like Malaysia for 3 months? So this is a very interesting part of my trip. I specifically decided to stay in Malaysia for 3 months, and it's the longest, it's the country that I'll be spending the most time in over the next few months. And the reason for that was, I highlighted on some of those factors earlier, was I really wanted to utilize the low cost of living here to really invest in the skills I need to develop the products that I want to develop. So it was very important that I had that low cost base. But then there's another factor that I think a lot of people discount, and they look at somebody who's traveling, digital nomads who are flying around and changing destinations every 2 to 3 weeks. And what they don't realize is that when you're frequently traveling, and even when you just go on a normal holiday from your job, the most exhausting part is, getting to the airport, getting on the flight, all that initial setup, like the day before you pack your bags and you get on your plane and go to where you're going. And it's an exhausting process. And if you do that process of changing locations too frequently, ultimately it interrupts your energy and your health, and I think that very frequent high-paced travel is not good for you. Now, that is not to say that I won't have that on my trip. It is just happening much later in my journey. There is a point where I am going to be spending a week in Sri Lanka again, and then a week split between France and the UK before I get to Canada, and again travel slowly. But I know that by having that fast travel, if my entire trip was like that, it would be very unsustainable, because I would not have the energy and the health to deal with the challenges I need to deal with, which are work challenges. So it's one of these things where I wanted to give myself the energy, and I wanted, very importantly, the shine of a new destination to rub off. I want to live like a local. So where I'm living in Georgetown, it was super fun, because when I arrived here, it was Chinese New Year. It was absolutely insane. And I got to experience that like a little bit of a tourist. But I've been here for almost 6 weeks now. And it's one of these things where I feel more like a local. I walk past all these temples all the time, and they're beautiful things. And of course, I should notice them and be aware of them and grateful for them. And I am, but I'm no longer in that tourist mood. I am very much like a local. I know where to go and eat. I'm not making as much decisions pertaining to my pleasure every day, which means I can focus on my work. So that is the core concept behind deciding to travel slowly. I did not want to be packing my bags every week or every 2 weeks on a regular basis, and at the same time trying to unlock my creativity and my productivity. It just would not happen. So being somewhere and basing myself in Georgetown, Malaysia, for me is a huge blessing because it just allows me to focus on my work. I'm in an environment that I chose. I have minimized my distractions significantly, and it is, I hope, it is going to be a game changer in when I look back at this period. I really do hope that this is going to be one of those things where I'm like, yep, that was a great decision. So then the next thing people ask is, out of all the places in Asia, why did you specifically choose Georgetown, Penang, Malaysia? So, I mean, there's many reasons for this. I think when I was originally kind of exploring where I would stay, I was potentially looking at traveling a little bit faster and maybe splitting my 3 months in Malaysia up between like a month in Malaysia, a month in Vietnam, a month in Indonesia. So I was still tossing up a few things. But the biggest reason that actually got me to come here was I got an incredible deal on the rent I'm paying. So I'm basically paying, my rent is about 1,200 Malaysian ringgit per month. And my living expenses are significantly lower than that. We're talking like food and everything else. So in Australian dollars, if I convert that back, 1,200 Malaysian ringgit is about 400 Australian dollars. So I'm paying almost less than $100 per week for a living space, which includes my internet, my electricity, my water, and it's actually a very nice space. I'm living in a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I have everything that Georgetown has to offer at my feet, like it's at my doorstep. I can walk there, and it is such a beautiful and culturally rich place to live, and I'm doing it for, again, less than $100 Australian dollars a week. So for those of you listening from other parts of the world, and maybe you convert everything to US currency, I think that we're kind of talking about 250 to 300, maybe like 250 US dollars a month is what I'm paying for rent. And as I said, my living expenses aren't much more than that. So in Australian dollars, I calculated what I spent last month, and it was not more than 1,800 Malaysian ringgit. So 1,800 ringgit is going to be, something like 600 Australian dollars. It is going to be maybe 400 US dollars. I'm just doing very rough conversions off the top of my head. And so my cost of living, like my rent, my food, my everything, is extremely cheap. And it is just one of these things where I'm like, okay, this was a really good choice, because I knew that when I initially started my journey, there is a very high chance that majority of what I build will not make any money. So I said, when you're taking risks and when you're trying to be more creative and when you're trying to deal with your skill issues, be somewhere where it's very, very cheap. And this has definitely ticked the box. So that was a huge reason. The next thing was, I've heard a lot about Penang from people who have been in my life, and they've always said Penang's great. It's got a great food scene. So I think that was a huge attraction. I knew I was going to be able to eat well. And I mean, that sounds very basic, but it truly is incredible. The diversity of food and just how cheap some of it can be, and the fact that you can go and have a Michelin star meal for something like 4 or 5 Australian dollars, and which is even less in US dollars, right? So it's really incredible. Sorry, let me be correct. They're not always Michelin starred, but they are Michelin selected, so they were kind of in the final rankings. But this is incredibly good, tasty food, and it is just everywhere and stunning. There are like hawker markets everywhere. Of course, you can spend a lot of money buying food, but there are many options to eat very cheap, and it is incredibly delicious. So I knew that was something I was going to particularly enjoy. And then culturally, I also like the history. So Georgetown was started as a British trading post, so the British East India Company back in the 18th century. And it's one of these things where you can definitely see that. And when you go to cities like Singapore and you've seen all the development that's happened, I imagine that what Georgetown is today, the fact that it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site and they've any buildings can't be torn down and things like that, it really represents what an old British trading post might have looked like. Now, of course, it doesn't look like how it did 100 or 200 years ago. There definitely are changes. Some of the buildings are, have got into decay. Some of them have been torn down and whatever. And, before it had World Heritage status. So it's not like a perfect replica of what a British trading town would look like. But you definitely do get those vibes. And I think it is just a beautiful place to live. I mean, considering that this is the capital of Penang, the fact that there are very few buildings above 2 to 3 stories is incredible. There are big cities on Penang Island and on the Penang mainland, but Georgetown itself it's a very kind of low-lying place, and there is just beautiful mountains on the island. I'm really looking forward to going and doing a few hikes, and I just knew that this was going to be a place I enjoyed, and so far I'm extremely happy. I think I've made the right choice in terms of good culture and good food. And I knew it was a very ethnically diverse part of Malaysia as well. So that was the other draw point. I knew that there was a predominantly, Chinese population on the mainland, which is ethnic oddity. But there is also a mixing of cultures. You have Indians, you have Chinese, Malays, and everyone lives pretty harmoniously, at least I would say as an external observer, but I also think that's very true. I mean, Malaysia seems like an incredibly tolerant place, and it's quite amazing that being a Muslim country, you kind of have this pocket of everyone, this melting hot pot. So I have 2 mosques near my house. There's a nightclub on the street on the street where there's a mosque, and it's like all of these things. I'm not sure how happy they all are about each other, but they do seem to coexist, and it's a very, I think, positive thing to have that. So I'm definitely enjoying living here. I love the cultural diversity, and it's been very good. The next point was, as I said, I am traveling very slow for the next 3 months, given that I'm really not traveling and I've just based myself in Georgetown, and I go to my co-working space, I go to cafes, and I do work, and that is all I do. But of course, I do want to go and do a little bit of travel while I'm here. You don't want to waste that opportunity, and being in Georgetown, I'm quite close to many things in Malaysia, so I can get to Langkawi. It's a less than an hour flight. It's 40 minutes to go to Langkawi Island. There are also other cities in nearby, such as Ipoh, which apparently also have a very good food scene and have a kind of very nice culture as well. So I'm very excited to make a few smaller and shorter trips out there, and it's just nice to base yourself somewhere where it's cheap, the culture's good, and you're in close proximity to things you might want to see and do. So that is why I ended up picking Georgetown. Initially, it was the cost of living and the fact that I got such a great deal on rent, which brought me here, but I have zero regrets. In fact, thinking to a alternate version of this trip where I was changing destinations every month, I do not think it would have been good for my productivity. Of course, great for the travel, but that is not exclusively what I'm here for. In terms of things I've really enjoyed in Georgetown was the Chinese New Year festivities. I would highly recommend anyone thinking about coming to Georgetown and Penang, if you can time your trip for the 15-day period where they have Chinese New Year, it is absolutely spectacular. I mean, one of the things about being in a Chinese community outside of mainland China is I feel there are certain aspects of the culture which have both been retained and might be different to what is in mainland China, especially since the Cultural Revolution happened. But there are also parts of that culture which have adapted to being away from mainland China, and it's adapted to being in proximity to other communities such as the Malays. And I think it's a very beautiful thing to see. So I definitely recommend people coming out here. If you can visit during Chinese New Year, definitely do that. And whilst Ramadan is starting tomorrow on the 12th here in Malaysia, I'm very excited for the Ramadan markets in Penang. I'm also visiting Ipoh later, so apparently they're very good out there. So I am very excited for the month of Ramadan and to experience what Malaysia is like. So these are some of the things that I've definitely really enjoyed. Now, for the final question, it's where to next. So after this section of my travel, I am continuing to Cambodia for a month, and from there I will have a very quick hop over Europe and to North America, where I will be for about a month and a half prior to carrying on to Japan. My pace of travel definitely does increase. But the way I see it is in this 3 months, I will be paying down a lot of those inefficiencies that I have. I will be paying down a lot of the skill issues. So it makes sense that I can afford to take on, I guess, a much more intensive travel schedule, because I will be more efficient, creative, and productive due to having gained the experience. So for me, the key milestones before I carry on to my next place is make sure you get your first public facing product launched. Because I know that no matter how bad the initial cuts are, I'm going to learn so much from that process. I'm currently working on an Android application to help people get more out of their meditation and to actually build a meditation practice which is going to serve them. And the way I've done that is to combine that with spiritual texts. So the only way to unlock spiritual texts is to do the meditation. So it's a weird gamification, but it will hopefully make the practice of meditation more rewarding. I've been using it myself and as I test it, and I think it is something that, I've built to meet my own needs, but I really do hope it's going to help other people. So before I leave Malaysia, I want to release that. Ideally, I'm going to be launching that sometime in the next 2 weeks, preferably this week, but I know that I will always run into problems as I have. I will be banging my head against the wall, but that's why I'm here. So I'm really excited to continue my journey, to continue working and to enjoy my trip around the world, but really I'm less of a traveling nomad and more of a working nomad. So hopefully that has answered some questions that people might have about why I've quit my job and why I've decided to travel rather than stay back in Sydney. It is very important to recognize that, I can do this. I have the privilege to do this. And for that reason, I think it is all the more valuable for me to go ahead and do this, because I know that I'm not always going to be able to. There is going to come a time when I can no longer walk. There is going to come a time when I can no longer see and I can no longer hear. So the fact that I'm able to experience the beautiful things and the beautiful cultures that the world has to offer is incredible in its own right, and I'm deeply grateful to be able to experience all of it. And with that, I'm going to end this episode here, and I wish everyone listening to this great success on all your endeavors. You've just made it through another episode of Monologues by Hassie. It brings me great pleasure to know that you made it to the end. To listen to more episodes, subscribe on your favorite podcast app or visit monologuesbyhassie.com. Thanks for swinging by.